Now we've seen the process that we need to develop, we're going to create our first component. This component is going to log into the Acme Academy. In order to get started, we're going to use the Robotic Enterprise Framework template. This is the industry standard for development. There are a lot of additional workflows within this framework, so don't worry too much. It's important that we use this so that we can save time later on. We're going to call this process the Acme Academy process, and this is the name of our project file. We're greeted with the state machine, and again, don't worry too much, but first of all, what we want to do is we're going to create a new component. This component is going to be called Acme Login. It's always a good idea to name your components with something sensible. Click Create, and we're greeted with a blank screen. It's good to create a separate folder for the components that apply to specific applications. In this case, we're going to click Add New Folder, Acme, and we're going to drop our Acme Login component into the Acme folder. A component is effectively a function which can be stored in a separate workflow. This allows us to break up our project into manageable chunks. A component can be a sequence or a flowchart. Typically, components are held in sequences because they are a short series of events which we don't want to get overcomplicated. So now we've got our Acme Login component, we're going to use the recorder to record the steps for us and see what the results are. We're going to click Web, and when the toolbar pops up, let's click Record. Please note that when we're recording this process and developing it, we'll be doing it in Internet Explorer, not in Chrome. Let's navigate to our Internet Explorer window. Now, if you want to temporarily pause the recorder, you can press F2, which gives you 3 seconds to load the application that you want to load. As you can see, UiPath automatically recognizes elements on the page. In this case, we want to click into the email box and type our email address for the application. Let's click Empty Field to make sure the field is always empty before we enter that information. Press Enter. You can see that the robot types the information automatically. Next, click into the password box. This time, click Type Password to ensure that others can't see your password as you're typing it, and to inform UiPath that this is a password field. Also click Empty Field. Type in your password, click Enter, and again the robot enters that information. Next, click Login, and you should be greeted with the dashboard. Press Escape to stop the recorder, and make sure you click Save and Exit so you don't lose your recording. We can see that UiPath has recorded each of the steps that we took. It's attached to the browser window, and if we look at the selector, we can see that the browser window name is the Acme System 1 account login page. It's typed the user email into the email box. It's then securely extracted the password and typed that password into the password box. Here you can see that it's used a variable. So in the get password activity, the result is the password variable. If we look into the variables panel, we can see a new variable called password has been created of type string. Then we can see that the button's been clicked to log in. And if we look at the target, this also shows a selector. And in this case, we can see that it's a button that belongs to the Acme System 1 application and has an ID of button login and of course a tag of button. The selectors are vital because these are the ways in which UiPath recognizes the elements that it's working with. For example, if it's a button in an application or if it's a text field in an application, it needs to know that it's clicking the exact button that we want to click. There may be elements on the page which have the same information or similar information. We need to make sure that it's specific enough so that it picks the right option and only the right option, but generic enough so that it can work for multiple cases. So for example, if the user's name was included in the account login application name, we'd want to remove that. We can do this by adding a wildcard into the title or any of the element names to make sure that the selector works for multiple instances. So let's log back out and let's run this robot to see what happens. We can see that it enters the username, the email address, clicks login, and if we go back into the application, we can see that the dashboard has been reached successfully. This login component is good, but it only works for one particular email address. In order to make this component dynamic, we need it to accept different values. We can do this by creating arguments. We can find arguments in the arguments panel below. Let's create a new argument, and we're going to call it in username, and a second argument called in password. The in that precedes the variable name indicates the direction of the argument. An argument coming in is something that we're passing to a component. An argument out would be a value that we're passing back to a different workflow. So in the default value, we're going to enter a different email address. So let's put paul@rpabox.com, which we know to be an invalid email address. And in the password field, we're going to just type password1. Don't worry for the time being that we can see that password. We'll address that problem later on. We're going to remove the get password activity because this was only relevant when we were doing the recording initially. In the activities, we're going to change the hard-coded value of the email address to our new argument, which is in username. Anytime the in username argument is used, the value that is associated with it will be passed into the workflow. Now, we're no longer using the variable password. We're going to be using the argument in password. One thing to note is we still have that variable existing. If we click onto the type input password activity, we can see that the password variable still exists. Let's delete that to avoid any confusion. So we still have the same activities, but this time the process is going to pick up the values from the default values of the arguments. Let's run it and see what happens. Make sure that you're logged out first. Great. Looks like the process worked successfully, and this time the robot has used paul@rpabox.com and its associated password. Now, of course, this wasn't a valid email and password combination, as we can see from the message box. This is an important consideration because you need to be able to handle incorrect combinations of emails and passwords and other errors as you build your projects and processes. However, we're not going to deal with this at this point, but it is something that we will address later on. So we now have a workflow which accepts arguments. This means that we can call the workflow from a different... This means that we can call the workflow from a different workflow. In this case, we're going to use our process.xaml file to invoke or call the workflow that we've just created. Let's open it up and have a look. Initially, this process is blank. If we go to our activities, we're going to search for invoke. We're going to select invoke workflow file and drag it into our main panel. Let's search for our newly created Acme login component. Click open and press import arguments. When you import the arguments, it automatically picks up the default values that are in the component, if there are any. Also, it automatically tells you which arguments it's expecting into that component. This is very much like a function in other programming languages. So, for in username, let's update that to a value that we know will work. And let's update the password. However, I don't want to show you what my password is, so we're going to use the get password activity in this process to pick up the correct password. I'll search for get password, drag the activity into the process. I'm then going to type my password, which you can now see is secure. I now need to store that password into a new variable. Press Ctrl K. I'm going to call it Acme password just to make it a bit more specific. And you'll see that variable is automatically being created in the variables panel. When I go back to my arguments, this time I can click edit arguments because I don't need to re-import them. Rather than hard coding the password 1 value, what I'm going to do is reference the newly created str Acme password variable. Click OK. Press Ctrl S to save. Now, let's run the process and see what happens. Let's check we're logged out. Let's clear the fields. Press run, or alternatively press F5 to run. We can see the username and password have been entered correctly, and we've logged in successfully to the application. Now we've learned how to create arguments in and out of a workflow and how to call that workflow and to pass arguments from one process or one workflow to another.